A questo punto inizia la trasmissione. Tutti i partecipanti sono in grado solo di ascoltare.
A very good morning to each and every one of us, wherever it is that we are joining this event from. It is a momentous day, a momentous event. We are here for the launch of the Grids4Africa program that is geared towards creating awareness on grid infrastructure. Now, talking about grid infrastructure, of course, electricity grids are the bedrock of today's and tomorrow's power systems. And they also will help us to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And if you look at Africa today, we are talking about 500 million people lacking access to electricity. I'm sure this is not news to us, but the sad bit about this is that an extra 10 million businesses across the African continent do not have access to electricity, which means more expensive businesses for these 10 million businesses we're talking about on the African continent. And so there's need to increase power generation, and the grid infrastructure does play a humongous role in bringing this to life as well, to increase not just the access, but also improve the infrastructure that we have today. What we have today might be a bit of outdated infrastructure, and so there's need to digitalize most of this infrastructure across the African continent. And so we're looking at an average of maybe 27 years that it has taken for some of the African countries to move from about 20% of access to electricity or electrification to 80%. So give an example of a country like South Africa. It took 27 years for them to improve from 20% access to electricity to 80% that they currently have at the moment. But for other African countries, it doesn't have to take that long with improved and modern grid infrastructure in Africa. So welcome to Grids4Africa, a program by the Renewable Energy Solutions for Africa Foundation that, like I mentioned, is meant to create awareness on the infrastructure, the needs, and as well as the opportunities for Africa's grid connections. And so we're here to have a great conversation, but also to learn. I hope that for those of you who are here to learn, there's going to be quite a lot that we're going to take out of this event today. So without wasting more time and without saying so much, I'd like to kick off our program by inviting our speakers. To start with, the opening remarks, Salvatore Barnabé, who is the president for Resiliency and head of the Enel Global Power Generation. The floor is yours now. A warm welcome. I'm going to ask that you unmute your sound.
Sorry for that. Do you hear me now?
Okay, yes, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I would like to share with you my to this event and having the possibility to start with this short introduction. This event has been very well welcomed by all the operators that we are working with within the Foundation Resiliency, but all with the other players and partners that we are collaborating with the Resiliency, the different authorities, the market operators, etc. Because at the end, we are adding another piece to the puzzle of building a sustainable Africa and to build a better future for Africa. So just let me remind shortly what is Resiliency about. If we can go to the next chart, please. So what we do at Resiliency, our mission is to work to create an enabling environment that will make possible energy investment in Africa. I don't want to give you figures of detail because we have such a large number of distinguished guests in this event, and I let them go into detail. But what I can tell you that there is a strong need in doing something different to create the condition to attract investment that are till today very, very low in Africa. So the foundation got a network of different leaders from different sectors of the energy world, including the utilities, but also agencies, academy, research institutes, service providers, etc. And they put in contact this bunch of people, of players, together with the African partners, with an approach that is a peer-to-peer approach, with an approach that tends to share lessons learned, that tends to do together analysis, that tends to listen a lot about the real needs of Africa, and tends to leverage on the know-how, on the expertise. So creating this nexus, this bridge, and trying to not repeat all the mistakes that have been done in the development of energy in other parts of the world, so that we could also accelerate the development in energy in Africa. And we are pursuing this mission through some activities that are here resumed. The first one, the missing link, an initiative that we have been carrying on with the UNECA, that is about defining, investigating what is the current openness, attractiveness of readiness of the African countries' regulatory framework, and defining a strategy here to understand what has to be changed. So what is the missing link here to start up with the development of renewables and of, in general, energy investment. In this year, we will publish the report about 17 countries that have been analyzed, and so we will give also this contribution. Renew Africa is another important initiative that had been launched almost 2 years ago, and whose aim is to encourage the creation of an European comprehensive program for renewable energy investment in Africa. So these programs want to learn from the success, but also from the mistakes that we have done in the past, also as a European Union in trying to support Africa. And it works in building a policy dialogue, a capability, technical expertise, giving the technical assistance, but also in proposing and try to structure a financial de-risking framework that could make the projects bankable, so that this investment could be attracted to Africa. Other activities have to do with the access to energy program, and we are here leveraging on the water, energy, food nexus approach. And remember that one of our scope is the one of reaching the SDG number 7. And finally, would I also to remember our initiatives about innovation and digitalization. We are convinced that in Africa, there is not a sense in speaking about energy transition. Here, we have to speak about sustainable energy development. So innovating from the very beginning, digitizing from the very true when we speak about networks, as we will see today, it makes a lot of sense if we want to make the development sustainable from the very beginning. And finally, working on capacity building programs addressed both to the institutional, let's say, organizational and also to high-level managers from Africa. And we have been training more than 570 people so far in the advanced training course, but also another initiative that is called the Microgrid Academy, where we are involving young people, fostering the concept of entrepreneurship also in Africa. And we will launch today the Grids4Africa, that will be the additional piece to the recipe of building a brighter and more sustainable Africa for the future. If we can move to the next chart, so why grids? It's has already been reminded in the introduction, but I mean, grids are necessary to the development of an energy systems. And although it could seem obvious, my experience having worked in different countries around the world is that the countries understand how important are the grids, the transmission grids, both, and the distribution grids when it's too late. The generation investment tends to go before. And then when you discover that there are bottlenecks, that there are constraints to further development, you understand that you should have planned better the development of transmission and distribution. So in general, grids are necessary. They have the same importance of level of the development of the generation. So they obviously ensure access to electricity. Otherwise, we will have just a part of the works done. But they could also foster and accelerate a higher penetration rate of renewables. So why grids in Africa? Because next chart, please. As I was said before, we want to do the right things from the beginning in Africa. We want to avoid to repeat mistakes that we have done in other parts of the world. Can you go to the next chart, please? So in this case, we strongly believe that a full electrification in Africa could be reached only if we pursue this effort from the very beginning. The socioeconomic development could be possible if we pursue together the effort in building digitized and modern grids in Africa. And this will be essential, fundamental, if we really want to achieve the Sustainable Development number 7, if we really want to give access to these 600 million people that have not access to electricity so far. Next chart, please. So at the end, we have seen why grids in Africa, and why Grids4Africa initiatives. I mean, we have done a lot of work in the last years, and we have built such a platform that give us credibility, that give us a strong network. So we have put in place a framework on how to carry on strategic analysis. We have put in place dialogue with different countries, with different institutions here, and about how to do this strategic dialogue with the policymakers. We have been put in place different activities in terms of capability building, in organization to do this capability building. And we have put in place different activities like the Renewable Africa I reminded before, in understanding how to improve in the financing and in the collaboration among public and private. All this effort I've been doing in order to foster the investment in renewables. So we have already the mindset, we are ready the organization, we are ready this concept of platform, and just adding the piece of the grids would have a lot of work already done, because sometimes the players, the counterparties will be the same. And at the same time, we are also attracting in Grids4Africa further people for their companies here who are more interested in the business of Grids4Africa and who are more the expertise about grids respect to the members that we have been involved so far that were more specialized in the development of generation. So Grids4Africa means leveraging something that already exists, is demonstrating to work very well, adding this other piece and trying to do both things at the same time. That was the original idea that I remembered before at the beginning of my speech. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you will enjoy this event. And I would like to remind that this is also a particular year, 2021, with a lot of events, the COP26, the G20, a lot of events that we want to use to promote these initiatives and to remind to everyone that time to act is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salvatore Bernabe, who is the president of Grids4Africa and head of NL Global Power Generation. Thank you so much for those remarks. And also, he's talked about the importance of adopting grids and grid infrastructure to help close the electricity access gap on the African continent. Very important. Our next speaker is Brent Warner, who is the head of Power Sector Unit for the World Energy Outlook. He's the head of Power Sector Unit for the World Energy Outlook at the International Energy Agency. Brent Warner is going to be talking about grids as the bedrock of electricity systems. The floor is yours now, Brent.
Thank you, Joy. And very, very happy and proud to be part of this launch event today. The International Energy Agency has highlighted the importance of the issue of energy access for more than 20 years, particularly our executive director, Dr. Fatih Birol. This has been an issue that has been on his plate for the past several decades and continues to raise to the global community. I would commend then Grids4Africa Foundation for the initiative here and the Grids4Africa program, which surely raising the emphasis on electricity networks and the importance of grids is a key step in the overall development for Africa and the many countries in Africa. So I would just, in my remarks, to help set the scene, and I wanted to say a few words about the starting point, the path forward, and the critical importance of electricity networks in that, drawing on some results from our recently released Africa Energy Outlook, which came out in 2019, that focused very much on the country-specific situations. So from a starting point, I think we need to recognize that first, we are in a rare time here, unfortunately, with the COVID-19 global pandemic, which is having one of the largest shocks, largest effects on the energy sector. Of course, in addition to the the negative health outcomes and health concerns, which is of course primary, we are also seeing then large impacts on energy through the global economy and through overall energy demand. So if you click forward once, we see that actually in 2020, so if you could click forward one. In 2020, we're seeing one of the largest drops in year-to-year energy demand in the world as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So this is in many ways destabilizing sort of the energy sector and sending shock waves throughout. This is within Africa and of course around the world, where the scale of the shock is something we've only seen in world wars, the Great Depression, and even going back to the Spanish flu. And one of those impacts is very much on the investment sector. Next slide, please. For where we're seeing, if you click ahead a few times, that in Africa, for example, the investments we've seen in 2020 versus 2019 fell dramatically across a number of areas. Overall, we saw about a 1/3 reduction in Africa. This is compared to a 20% reduction at the global level. And so we're seeing those impacts being very serious in the short term, but then they also clearly have long-term effects. One bright spot here already is that actually renewables investment increased in Africa in 2020, which is very good news. And also kind of foreshadows, I think, the development pathway for Africa going forward. And if you click forward once more, we're also seeing, though, that there's an impact on sovereign risk in 2020, an increase then in the level of sovereign risk, which of course then raises financing costs throughout the energy sector and also for electricity networks, which will be very critical to be scaling up. And so this is an important factor to consider and to watch, and also an area where the international community to help make available lower cost financing for the development of Africa and its grids will be essential. Next slide, please. And as mentioned by Salvatore, there's if you can click ahead a few times, there's a very serious challenge here, and also Joy in the opening and in the opening presentation and slides, we saw that the impact on the poorest is in fact some of the larger effects currently. And in particular, if we looked at access to electricity, we've seen an uptick in the number of people without access to electricity in Africa in 2020 for the first time in close to a decade. There had long been an increase going back to over the past 20 years, but very strong progress had been made in the last 5 years, and particularly this has a risk to be turned around with more difficult situations. So this is to clearly say that the issue is not one of the past, is one that's very clear and present today, and we need to make sure that the momentum that has been building is continued. And we see out of that total 600 million people without electricity access in Africa in 2020, about half of that is in just 5 countries. And I think that's very clear in this initiative and overall that keeping in mind the country-specific context is critical to the work, to the analysis. And this is also a part where the International Energy Agency, we're engaging with countries through training, through on both data and energy modeling, to also increase in-country skills and analysis to help tackle these skills and ultimately move towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 7, as mentioned, for sustainable and affordable energy. Next slide, please. And if you click forward. And part of our work is looking forward. I work on the World Energy Outlook and also contributed to the Africa Energy Outlook, where we're looking at the next 20 to 30 years and how the global energy system is going to develop. And one of the key aspects there is we're going to see the importance of electricity rising. And this is also very true in Africa. The amount of electricity demand growth over the next 20 years would be about twice, or lead to a system that's about twice the size that it is today. And if you click forward, and there's potential for much more growth. So if we take the Africa case, which we looked at following Agenda 2063 targets, if you achieve those where you have very positive feedbacks between economic development and energy use, the amount of electricity demand could then be almost triple what it is today. And so this, of course, will rely on building out the underlying infrastructure, electricity networks, and making sure that that supply of electricity is reliable, stable, and affordable for all citizens. If you click forward, please. And one more click. And a key element here I just want to highlight is, of course, the massive potential for renewable energy in Africa. So in recent years, in electricity, there's been growth of fossil fuels and renewable energy. And as we go forward, increasing the emphasis with lower cost technologies, solar PV, wind power, there is a great potential for Africa to follow a different development pathway that is still affordable, is the most affordable pathway, in fact, tapping into domestic renewable energy resources for its own development. And so if we look at kind of a growth here going forward, solar PV, which is becoming sort of the king of electricity markets around the world, also that would be the case in Africa with massive potential spread across the continent. Please, next slide. But that will take, this kind of development will also take a massive increase in investment. So what we've mentioned, what we've seen about growth to meet electricity demand, to tap into renewable energy projects, it will require more than doubling the amount of investment, and that's in electricity generation and also in networks over the next 2 decades. Actually, and continuing, if we want to tap further those potential and further see this positive development through productive uses, expanding, providing energy access to the 600 million without it today and the growing population, we're talking about actually a 4 times level of investment as we have today, or we had in 2018, which is a very serious amount, a very serious scale up. But to try and put that in context, this is not outside the realm of what other developing economies have done in the past. Please click forward one. Where, in fact, we've seen in recent years that India has, in fact, invested more as a share of GDP than what would be required in an Africa case here, and certainly more than what's planned under stated policies. And so you're more in line also with what China has done over the past 2 decades going forward. And so to say that this is a serious challenge, but not insurmountable. Next slide, please. And of course, we need to not only take the country-specific considerations, but also a geographic consideration. Of course, Africa is a very large continent. We've been engaged in geographic information analysis of the energy access issue, of the networks that are in place today, and how we could expand them and also provide that provide energy access, particularly electricity access, to those without it. And the key point is here that we certainly see a mix of both centralized solutions through expanding the electricity networks, reinforcing them, strengthening them, complemented also by decentralized solutions. We have off-grid systems and standalone systems to reach the most remote communities and to make sure that all citizens are reached and provided with, again, reliable and affordable clean energy. Please, next slide. And then to close, just click forward once more. To close, to say that this is not also just an Africa story, to put it in the global context, as the world moves towards meeting its overall climate ambitions, in particular, net zero strategies are being deployed and being developed here ahead of the Conference of Parties, the 26th Conference of Parties to be convened in November. Those net zero ambitions, we've done a recent analysis showing that the path to reaching net zero emissions is dependent on electricity and is very much dependent on electricity networks. Again, a combination of centralized and decentralized solutions will get us ultimately there globally. And so this is a story consistent with the path needed in Africa, but also around the world. There's a call and a recognition that indeed electricity networks are the foundation, the bedrock of electricity systems and in fact of modern economies going forward. And with that, I would like to close and again commend Grids4Africa on this initiative and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent Warner, for those remarks. And of course, the need to replace aging infrastructure is a very important one as well, which now brings us to our next speaker, who is going to be talking about building back better with modern infrastructure. Jean-Paul Adam, who is the Director of Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resources Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. The floor is yours now. Yeah, take it away.
Thank you so much, Joy, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone who's following us. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to present the greetings on behalf of Dr. Vera Songwe, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who has been very supportive of this process and conveys her best wishes to Grids4Africa and recognizes the important role that Grids4Africa is going to have for us to achieve the not only SDG 7, but all of the SDGs, because Africa, having such a low base in terms of its energy investment, the need for investment in energy is a prerequisite for achieving so many of the other SDGs. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll be talking about building forward together better through sustainable infrastructure and the opportunity that exists to actually address the problems in terms of achieving the SDGs, where Africa is off track in relation to tackling the SDGs. Also respond to the challenge of COVID-19 and how we can build forward better, how we can revamp African economies and change the model of development in Africa. And thirdly, how we can build in climate resilience through those processes. So Africa has an energy paradox with some of the largest availability of energy that is available on the continent, including, as is well known, an abundant solar radiation of over 5 kilowatt hours per square meter in most places. At the same time, we've already heard the very dramatic figures around the problems of access to electricity, and I think we saw from IEA just before the challenge of the rise in number of people who do not have access to electricity, and how we have to arrest this problem as quickly as possible. And even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we saw was there was not necessarily a reduction at pace of the number of people who had access to electricity. One of the biggest factors in terms of the challenges for access to electricity is the limited and weak transmission and distribution, and very importantly in the African continent, the low cross-border trade also in electricity. So where electricity may be produced in one area, it can be difficult to transmit it to rural areas or from one country to another. And we'll also know the very low installed capacity, and we can see the extremely big differences between the amount of installed capacity in Africa and compared to China and India. And the way forward is to ensure that African countries have secure, affordable, and reliable energy to address COVID-19, to industrialize in a sustainable way and achieve the goals of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and consequently also boost economic growth, reduce poverty, and increase inclusion, and address all of these needs in the context of the demographic dividend and increasing urbanization, as well as the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, Africa is not on track to meet SDG 7, and why is that? Firstly, the limited electricity supply. In rural areas in particular, this is dominated by biomass energy, where there's also insufficient generation of only 147 gigawatts of installed capacity, and low electricity access, again, linked to those elements. In 24 countries, almost half of the countries in Africa have electricity access rates of less than 50%. And Liberia, Malawi, Central African Republic, Burundi, and South Sudan have stagnated or reversed in electricity access, while Nigeria, the DRC, and Ethiopia have the biggest deficits. You can go to the next slide, please. There's an urgency for investment in sustainable infrastructure and the diversification of Africa's energy mix to build that true resilience. The access to affordable electricity is absolutely essential to achieve the SDGs and also Agenda 2063, and is also essential for the success of the Continental Free Trade Area and to build forward better in the context of COVID-19. And Africa has the lowest installed capacity. Most of that existing installed capacity is in South Africa and North Africa, and there is a need to generate to 250 gigawatts up to 2030 and investments of 40 billion per annum. So the levelized cost of energy of fossil fuel plants is more expensive than wind and solar currently, which therefore represents an opportunity when investing in renewables as one of the ways to get affordable and accessible energy most quickly to African citizens. It's important to note in here as well the availability, firstly, of natural gas and the need for investment in areas such as natural gas as part of the transition towards renewables, as Africa has the challenge of storage and the need to deal with the issue of intermittency, which will mean some additional investment in some forms of fossil fuel energy, unless we can address the issue of storage as part of the transition towards more renewables, even as renewables are reducing in costs. Can we go to the next slide, please? And one of the biggest challenges as well is, and I think this echoes what we've already heard from IEA, there is growing but insufficient private sector investment in electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. And the existing private sector investment is focused in a very few countries. If we look at this graph, we can see that most of that investment has been in a few countries such as South Africa, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and a few others. And the vast majority of African countries have not been able to channel significant private sector investment into their grids, into their transmission and distribution, as well as into generation. What we can see is that while IPPs have been rising very significantly, independent power producers, this reflects a policy shift that has been happening, but the investments are still small compared to the needs. And we can see that the growth of independent power producers, as well as the investment by Chinese operators, are now the fastest growth of sources of power investments in Africa when you exclude the Republic of South Africa. You can go to the next slide, please. And I'd already mentioned that the natural gas will play a very important role as part of the transition towards renewable energy and allowing this upscaling. Africa currently, the majority of its energy generation is through hydro, but the big problem of hydro has been the intermittency, which we have seen, for example, in Zimbabwe and Zambia and other parts of Southern Africa over the course of 2020, where droughts affected the availability of electricity in a very dramatic fashion. And this had direct correlating effects on the GDP growth and on the ability of businesses to prosper. And this was exacerbated, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic. So going forward, there is a need to address the question of intermittency. Renewables can play a very significant role, but when you look at the energy base being so largely dependent on hydro, the increased risk of climate change, there is a need to secure some energy bases. And the assessments done by ECA have shown that because of the availability of gas on the continent, it's relatively stable price, not necessarily cheap price. It would be an ideal transition form of energy. We can go to the next slide, please. So the ECA is supporting this process through its SDG 7 initiative, which is built on 3 pillars of sustainability, governance, and finance. And this is about, first of all, identifying potential sustainable energy investments that can be made by African countries, working with them about relating to the regulatory and policy environment in their countries, and using those reforms as well to raise finance from the private sector to address the gap that's available. But most African countries currently, and particularly in the context of COVID-19, have very severe fiscal space restrictions. Debt levels are rising, and their debt to GDP ratios are rising, and their revenue generation is also in negative figures. So these kind of support are aimed at particularly channeling private sector finance into independent power producer initiatives, but also increasingly looking at the transmission and distribution opportunities. And there are a number of countries that have undertaken assessments with the support of ECA around their transmission and distribution networks to identify areas that can be invested in as part of the work with the private sector. In some cases, this has also been linked to the development of certain industries, which guarantees certain uptake going forward. We can move on to the next slide. So the sustainable infrastructure investment is going to be critical for a green recovery, and energy is the platform for that investment. I've already mentioned the risk of increasing droughts, which is affecting the current largest base generation available in Africa. And we can note that there are already a huge commitments by African countries to invest in renewable energy in their NDCs, with over 22,000 megawatts within the existing NDCs. But the potential is even much larger, with the potential for installed capacity between 110 and 200 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. This represents a great investment opportunity, and channeling that investment will then create multiplier effects, which I'll go into in a moment. But one of the biggest factors will be de-risking the private sector investments, which can change the dynamic for renewable energy investment, as well as investment in grids and in transmission and distribution lines. Next slide, please. The ECA has undertaken a study which has assessed the impact in terms of green recovery by certain investments that could be undertaken in various countries, led by investment in sustainable energy infrastructure. So this is a focus on renewable energy investments, but also the associated infrastructure that would be done in, for example, moving towards electric vehicles, and in terms of the jobs created by situating a part of the value chain on renewable energies within specific countries. So we've currently done these studies in 4 countries, and we've looked at the impact that this would have in terms of the amount of jobs that would be created, as opposed to investment in traditional fossil fuel sectors, as well as the gross value addition that is created throughout the economy. So in light green, you can see the gross value added impact in the economies compared to fossil fuels, and in dark green, you can see in the green jobs impact. And in countries such as Kenya, we saw that the gross value added impact was 200% as opposed to fossil fuels. It was 130% in terms of the jobs created. In Egypt, the gross value added was 150%, while the number of green jobs created was 55% more. In the DRC, we saw a more pronounced impact in terms of the gross value added, where the 280% of more value added was created, while in terms of jobs, it was 130% more. And in the Republic of South Africa, where we had the most startling impact, and that's because of the relatively more industrialized nature of the economy, where the gross value added impact was 420%, while the amount of jobs created was 250% more than by similar investments in fossil fuel sectors. And these include investments, of course, in the grids, transmission and distribution lines. In countries such as DRC, the models included utility scale investment in grids, but also microgrids to reach some of the more rural areas. We can move to the next slide, please. The sustainable energy infrastructure investments are also a critical pathway to improve inclusion. And we can note that globally, IRENA has shown that there are 25 high-quality jobs created for each $1 million invested in renewables. This is particularly important in a continent such as Africa, where there's a large amount of informality, where more than 60% of men and 75% of women are in informal employment. We saw from the studies that ECA has done specifically that the job creation aspects are even higher. But here we're looking at particularly the high quality jobs which are associated with renewables as opposed to fossil fuels. There's a great impact as well in terms of the gender positive aspects of jobs created by renewables, with a 10% differential, with 32% of women, 32% of jobs in renewables being taken up by women, as opposed to 22% in the oil and gas sectors. We can move to the next slide, please. And we can see that in Africa, there is already a very significant opportunity in terms of investing in renewable energy transactions. And this can be dramatically improved by consistent investments in the energy grid, which can facilitate as well investments across borders through the African Continental Free Trade Area. There are 39,000 megawatts of announced renewable energy transactions in Africa, and the missing links in some cases are the appropriate grid infrastructure, but also, most importantly, the availability of affordable financing to structure these projects. We can move on to the next slide, and we're very close to the conclusion. So the final point that we would like to emphasize is, while Africa's energy gap is particularly a challenge, and the biggest part of the challenge is the regression that we are seeing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is also an unprecedented economic opportunity which leads to multiple multiplier effects, which can also create an unprecedented number of jobs, and therefore address the chronic informality that affects African economies. And that 500 billion opportunity in the next 10 years is something that we should really focus on to achieve universal access to affordable and reliable energy. Thank you very much, and back to you, Joy.
My microphone was mute. Thank you so much, Jean-Paul Adam, for those remarks as well. And he has touched on a number of important issues that I think need a lot of attention. And even for the next speakers who are coming on to talk about an enabling platform for the energy transition, we cannot leave out the fact that we also need to relook into our frameworks. What do our frameworks look like? How open are they to investment as well? I think those are the questions we need to ask. How do we go about financing of the grid infrastructure? How do we modernize them? Because just like Adam mentioned, Africa has the lowest installed capacity, and we're going to need about 250 gigawatts all the way up to 2030, and that's about $40 billion annual investment on the African continent. That is something that cannot be done without private investment. So we hope that our governments can be more open with our frameworks as well to make sure that this happens. Thank you so much, Jean-Paul Adam, who is the Director of Technology, Climate Change and Natural Resources Division at UNECA. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is none other than Mr. Antonio Camisekra, who is the head of NL Global Infrastructure Networks. He's going to talk to us about distribution grids and, of course, an enabling platform for the energy transition. It's so good to see you. The floor is yours now. Kindly unmute your microphone.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if somebody is going to broadcast my presentation. Yes, here it is. So thank you very much for organizing this launch event for the Grids4Africa. The scene has been set very well by the previous speakers, so I will jump immediately to slide number 4, if you help me with that. Okay. So in any energy system, and in particular in the context of the energy transitions, has been said already, distribution grids are the backdrop of, let's say, the foundation of the foundation layer of the energy transitions. In Africa, where we cope with two problems at the same time. One problem is, of course, the access to electricity, and the second is the fragile, let's say, infrastructure on which today the entire electric system is run in most of the African countries. So there is a kind of double behavior to bring forward. From one side, the energy supply that must happen massively through renewables, for the very simple fact that it will be easier, cheaper, more distributed, more affordable, and more compatible with the ambitions, the global and African ambitions to be sustainable. There must be a trend of energy access, where population has not a direct, stable, safe access to electricity, but at the same time, we need also that more and more industrial processes, or let's say transportation and other energy uses, will convert into clean electricity. To do that, as in any other, let's say, country of the world, there is, let's say, in between these two things, there are the distribution grids, where let's say the increment in energy flows and the participation of many more actors to the system will require massive investments in grid expansion from one side, and in grid digitization or modernization on the other side. So that's not an African peculiarity. This is, let's say, the narrative that it's valid basically all around the world. but in Africa, it's especially important because of what we will see very quickly in the next slides. So the question are, how can energy systems capabilities can be improved in an affordable way, and how can we attract investments in not only in the generation part but also in the infrastructure part? How can though public and private participation contribute to the development of the grids and the country growth in a system that by and large is dominated by national monopols? And how can innovation and digitalization help to maintain the level of investments within the spending power of the, let's say, final consumers? And finally, how the distribution system operator can help to facilitate the access to electricity? How can they contribute to social economical developments together with the flourishment of a renewable generation industry? So those are the big questions that are to be posed, and to which I believe Grids4Africa intend to provide an answer in the next years through the activities, seminars, congresses, let's say, that are typical of Resiliency, and that through the Grids4Africa project will be focused more and more on grids. Next slide, please. Next. So there is a fundamental problem in when we talk about the infrastructures, electric infrastructure, and particularly about transmission and distribution. And you can immediately see that the level of private participation is very, very low. And while the introduction of, let's say, independent power production mechanisms has allowed private capital to flow, not as it was needed, but at least more than what was in the past in the generation side. If we see the participation of private capitals in the infrastructure side, I mean, transmission and distribution, it's basically very poor or not existing at all. This is for two very simple reasons: regulatory from one side, and sector attractiveness on the other side. The results is that the contribution, not only from the financial, let's say, equity side, but also in terms of skills, capability, technology, best practices that private operators could bring into the sector, it's of course not present in the distribution side. And so it's like of a, let's say, spinning wheel. We have an inefficient energy system that contribute to the worsening of the financial, let's say, health of those companies, of the distribution companies, of the distribution sector and the transmission sector in Africa, that in turns make more complex the attraction of private capital into this sector. And this is let's say, a circle that must be broken as soon as possible, because without participation of private capital into the infrastructure business, the ambition to limit the, let's say, to foster, let's say, the access to electricity will be absolutely frustrated. Next slide, please. Okay, so private investments are, let's say, considered to contribute in a tangible way to social economical developments in that. So according to a recent study, global scale, infrastructure investment have, let's say, a rate of return in social economical benefits about 20%. In other words, if we invest $1 of infrastructure investments, the GDP can raise by 20 cents, which is very material. Moreover, it can be estimated that for each billion euro or dollar invested in distribution network projects, Africa could create around 20,000 jobs. So for every $1 billion investment, 20,000 jobs for direct needs, plus other indirect jobs that, let's say, are created for the, let's say, neighboring sectors. And this is a study made by McKinsey in 2020, so quite recent one. So if we move to the next slide, we can observe that the success cases of private-public partnership in managing distribution business. For example, the case of Bogota with more than 3 million customers, where private players hold a minority share but control the operation. Due to the culture, let's say the operating culture that is being brought by the private operators, the level, for example, of safety improved dramatically, and most importantly, the losses has been reduced by 50% in 50 years, improving materially the quality of the service. Similarly, just to make an example of a country where we do not operate yet, so this is not self-referential. In India, for example, in 2006, the Maharashtra owned distribution company granted to a private company, in this case is Torrent Power, a 10-year franchisee contract for managing the distribution activity. And the private company has made significant investment to improve the quality of the distribution company. And this brought to losses reduction over 50%, reducing the number of outages of more than 70%. And consequently, due to the good performance of Torrent Power, the franchisee has been renewed for an additional 10 years. These are two examples of, let's say, fruitful cooperation between the private expertise and the public ownership of a grid. Next slide, please. Here it comes to our track record. We are the largest distribution operator in the world. We are in 8 countries with 12 distribution companies. And these are the figures in which we represent the improvement of, for example, losses that we have achieved while managing our grids since the, let's say, the starting of ownership and operation, most importantly, of the, let's say, the private company. In this case, this is Enel. So as you can see, declining curve that show a constant, steady improvements of performances over time. Next slide, please. How can a private operator operate in? Now, of course, there are a number of possible cooperation models. But in principle, let's say a new cooperation model in Africa would allow public and private players to complement each other in order to successfully contribute to the sector development. If the right conditions are met, which is the goal of this initiative, to try to help to facilitate the creation of a possible environment, the private sector can play a prominent role in delivering let's say, crucial infrastructure for the African power's needs, starting, as we said, from the distribution grids. Distribution system operator with global experience and good track records can represent the best available option to scale up private sector participation in the power sector. This is very important because when we talk about grids, most of the reasonment goes in the direction of additional investment, massive investments. We all agree billions of euros or dollars will have to be casted in the sector in the next years. But let's remember that by simply acting as the best operator, so introducing the best practices in the African grids as they are today, a huge space of improvement is possible. At basically no cost for the final consumers. So here the contribution of a good private operator will be significantly visible in terms of quality, in terms of reliability, in terms of safety and stability of the grids, and very compatible with the affordability for the final consumers. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges for a successful, sustainable distribution system operator? This is just going beyond, let's say, providing electricity access to customers or solving pure technical issues. It means interacting with the regulator and institutions to deal with the customer needs, the daily customer needs. The most urgent ones, of course, being the first access to electricity in rural areas, but let's not forget that many, and a growing share of the population will be living in the so-called peri-urban areas of the mega cities in Africa, where different challenges will be posed to the infrastructure operator. So it means, as we said, interaction with regulators, with institutions, providing new technologies and services in view of accelerating the energy transition in order to allow also to African citizens to contribute to the story of sustainability that we are all, let's say, working for in the next 15 years. Next slide, please. So what we are strongly supportive of a platform-based business model where, let's say, distribution networks are enabling platforms where all the stakeholders of the value chain may interact with the system and get the most from their participation. So generators, prosumers, customers, electric vehicles, storage, and the new grid participants. These may somewhat look like too premature as a discussion in Africa, but let's remember that technology, and low-cost technology in particular, can be the most viable solution for African grids in order to extract the more from what we have already in place today, and allowing for more electricity generation, renewable generation, to connect to the grids with the same capability, and more, let's say, electric consumers to use their appliances, their electrical appliances, exchanging, for example, thermal boilers, thermal cars, and stuff like that. So it's a game of equilibrium between what we can achieve today with the infrastructure we have in place today and what we can create through the flow of investments that the private operators, the private, let's say, investors can bring into the system. Next slide, please. I've jumped now to the closing remarks, so let's go to the last slide. I believe that with the launch of the Grids4Africa program, an important milestone is definitely marked in the Resiliency Foundation, first of all, because it's for the first time that this foundation, very successful in the renewable space, can direct its attention to what we have said is a crucial part of the system. But grids are the complementary and essential infrastructure required to increase renewable hosting capacity and enable an affordable energy access in Africa, together with other initiatives that the foundation is bringing forward, like, for example, the Renewable Africa, or the many other, the capacity building, the institutional activities. We aim at incentivizing the adoption of renewable to meet the fast-growing energy demand, with essential support of the private sector. And likewise, Grids4Africa will contribute to define a political and regulatory roadmap with the aim of achieving similar results also in the space of electricity distribution. So we at Enel welcome this initiative, and we're ready to support it with our competencies, with our funding, with our knowledge, and with our passion. So I wish to Resiliency a very successful start on the Grids4Africa program, to which we will contribute daily since today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Antonio Camisecra, for those remarks. What can be achieved with the current infrastructure, and what could be achieved if we modernized a grid infrastructure to meet the demands of a growing urbanized population whose needs for electrification are also have almost tripled. So our next speaker is going to put into context the resilient grids to fight climate change. If we all know, or if we might know, that there have been so many effects of climate change around the globe, and so with climate change means that we also have to adjust how we're doing our daily business, and the renewable energy sector has not been left out. We also need to adopt those resilient grids to fight climate change. And so our next speaker is the Chief Executive Officer for SESI, Mr. Matteo Codazzi, who is going to put into context which are those grids that we need to adopt that can be resilient to climate change. Mr. Kodazi, the floor is yours now. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Kindly.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Joy. All right, thanks. Can we move to the next slide? 30 seconds, just a short introduction to Chasey. We're a global player in the engineering, testing, and power system consulting worldwide. We operate in 45 countries on a global scale. And even after the acquisition of Kima, we have now premises and offices in basically all the continents around the world. To the next one, please. What we do is we work with original equipment manufacturers in testing and developing the new frontier of technology, and we work both on big components for the high voltage networks, for instance, switches and distribution, but also we work on the low voltage side, especially in testing and developing all the smart grid components that are more and more used in the network. We also work with utilities and energy investors in the design, deployment, and integration of large-scale projects, be it HVDC lines, interconnection, or digital meters programs. We also work with governments, regulators, and financial institutions, donors, to advise them on power system regulation, energy markets, and feasibility studies. And we have performed many studies with the African Development Bank, for instance, in Africa, and also with other donors. Now, talking about resilience, we move to the next slide. I think the resilience has become, in the recent past, more and more a buzzword. But I would like to use the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission definition of resilience, which is the underlying capability of the electric grids to face a disruptive event without compromising the continuity of supply. Now, resilience has become a modern grid requirement since the number, the damages, and the cost posed by disruptive events have increased in the past years. And I think you can see here in the chart some of the figures related to some of the weather and climate disasters that just in the U.S. have happened and have caused many billions of damages to the grid and to the economy as well. Now we move to the next slide. However, when we talk about resilience, it's not only about resilience to extreme weather events. Not only extreme weather events are to be considered as disruptive events. A resilient grid is a grid that has also to withstand physical and more cyber attacks as well, together with electoral and geomagnetic disturbances. All of these events represent increasing threat to the grid security. Furthermore, there is also a systemic approach to the term and to the problems related to resilience. The entire electric value chain presents some kind of vulnerabilities, right? From the fuel supply to the end user. Now, in the traditional configuration of the electricity system, this means that the final consumer needs that all the upstream components of the value chain shall properly function to guarantee a continuous supply of electricity. And I think if we look what happened in February in Texas with the dramatic event that caused that huge blackout, I think we have, really spotted and being able to see how the failure of a single component can activate some serious cascading and system-wide problems leading to the huge blackouts and the huge disaster. So it's increasingly important to approach resilience with a system-wide approach, okay, system-wide framework. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. Now, resilience is, of course, a global requirement, but let's put it in context with regard to Africa. Now, there are several opportunities I believe, to implement resilience in the electric sector in Africa. First of all, as already been mentioned by other people in this panel, currently the electricity access to sub-Saharan Africa is very low. It's approximately 48% of people against the world average of 90%. And on average, in the last years, 20 million people per year are connected to the electric grid in Africa. And they can enjoy stable connection and stable access to electricity. Now, in order to reach a 100% access by 2030, so in the next, I'd say 9 years, the electric demand shall increase 4 times to the current amount, and the number of people getting access to electricity shall triple to 60 million people connected in Africa per year. Now, the electricity will be made available to the largest part by grid extension, whether other solutions, as already been mentioned, will be microgrids and distributed generation. Now, the aggregate amount of investments needed to reach the target of reaching 1% energy access by 2030 will be around $1 trillion, half of which focused and spent on generation facilities, and the other half spent on transmission distribution infrastructure, including microgrids. Now, this represents a fundamental opportunity to develop, since the very beginning, a power infrastructure which is already embedded with a modern resilience requirements. I mean, there is no need to go through, the various generation of old technology, etc. I think there is an opportunity here to jumpstart to the latest technology. So the technology that provides not only better performance, but also improved cost, right? Similar to what has already happened many years ago in Africa, when the cellular network and mobile telecommunication network was developed. You simply skip to the new technology. I think that the opportunity is here also for the technologies related to the transmission and distribution grid. Now, if we move to and this of course will create the opportunity to improve the grid reliability on one hand, and on the other also allowing or facilitating a decrease in energy prices. Now, if we move to the next slide, I think if we look at the solutions, the technical solutions that can be implemented for grid resilience, can we move please to the next slide? All right. I think we should look at mainly 2 main categories. One is using technology to the purpose of preventing outages, and the other is using technology to shortening interruption time once you have an outage. But also these solutions shall be complemented with monitoring activities. I mean, leveraging on Internet of Things, big data analytics to allow responsive actions and real-time operation, smart operation of the grid. Also thanks to predictive algorithms. Now, with this framework in mind, I believe that we can see and think about a framework which is based on 3 main pillars. One is creating smarter grids that are able to fix themselves in real time with the help of technologies such as smart meters, distribution automation, drones, etc., etc. The second pillar is realizing and implementing more robust grids, hardening in a certain sense infrastructures, also through underground lines, especially of course in urban areas, of course, isolating substations and transformers, or implementing redundancy through interconnections. And the third and last pillar is, of course, providing more distributed resources, which can act as backup or decrease the energy demand, especially in case of supply issues. And some examples of these kind of distributed resources are, of course, photovoltaic plants, the storage system, demand response, and energy efficiency measures. Now, we move to the next slide. Casey provides different type of solutions, and we have many experiences. For instance, in the grid modernization in Africa, for instance, we are supporting the development and implementation of a regional electricity market in the context of the West Africa Power Pool, setting up also grid code for the effective integration of the regional system. This is one of many references that we have in Africa. But also, I would like to
I think there's a bit of echo on your end. I don't know how we can fix that.
Can you hear me well now?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, okay. So there is also an important reference that I would like to pinpoint, and is related to why, and the reason for that is not because I'm, confused about geography, but most importantly because I believe it is a technical reference, a very interesting technical reference that can be used also and be of interest also for Africa. And Wales, is a big set of developments, and we have supported the Hawaiian utility to develop a grid modernization strategy aiming at operating 100% renewable energy grid by 2045. And this means that we have to plan for backup, not only resilience, but also backup solution, flexibility solution, and most importantly, integrating renewables with standard grid solution, of course, smart grid solution, and also microgrid, because these are the three main technological pillars. We also have developed, and this is a very other important, I think, aspect of resilience, is being resilient against the cybersecurity threats, right? And among many references that we have in the cybersecurity space, we also work with a big Italian power utility, identifying possible vulnerabilities and suggesting a set of procedures to reduce the risk associated to cyber attacks. Now, to conclude, if we can move to the next slide. Well, as changed, we address resilience in the development with many customers worldwide in the development of transmission distribution master plans by taking into account also the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we have the ability to develop master plans that take all those goals into consideration, and also able to optimize the performance of the grid, the resilience, the risk associated, and security supply risk associated with operating the grid, but also the capital expenditure profile. Also, as opposed to Europe, Africa enables to do from scratch, as I said, a resilient power infrastructure since the very beginning through a proper combination of transmission and distribution systems, microgrids, and distributed energy resources. And it is necessary that you put in place in due time an appropriate study and design of the power system in order to be able that all these three components are perfectly blended. Finally, last but not least, designing resilient grid requires the adoption of a probabilistic approach. And we talk about risk, it was about statistics and probabilities in order to assess the current risk and the prospective risk, right? And we have many tools that are allowing us and many experience with many customers worldwide in adopting this state-of-the-art probabilistic approach to the design of macros and grids. And I think by being among the funders and the main participant into this Grids4Africa initiative, will be more than pleased to contribute and support all the other participants into this big and important effort to modernize and allow Africa to further develop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matteo Codazzi, who is the Chief Executive Officer at SESI, for those interesting remarks. Creating smarter grids that are able to fix themselves in real time. It is a journey, but I think African countries are ready. They're now ready to adopt resilient grids to fight climate change as well. Our next speaker is going to
Joy, we don't hear you. Okay, now yes.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you so much, Mr. Matteo Codazzi, for those remarks. He's the Chief Executive Officer at SESI. Put into context, creating smarter grids that are able to fix themselves in real time. And I think that is what's needed right now as we adopt more resilient grids that can withstand the climate change and its effects as well. Our next speaker is going to talk about grid digitalization opportunities for Africa. Amel Shadley, the Vice President Strategy and Digital Energy for Middle East and Africa at Schneider Electric. It's good to see you. The floor is yours now. You have 15 minutes, or maybe 13.
Thank you very much.
Take it
It's a real honor to be today during this launch, which is a very important initiative for the SDG 7. In the name of Schneider, I want to congratulate for this amazing initiatives. We hope that we will be part during all the journey to achieve the SDG 7. Today, in fact, we'll talk about the digitalization. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So when we are talking about the digitalization, mainly in Africa, I'm always hearing that it's a very expensive solution. Is it the right solution for Africa? We have to first fix the basics, and then we'll go to more sophisticated solution, which is the digital. With this short presentation, what I want to show is what are the main challenges that the digital can fix, and request also to us if the digital is the most effective solution to Africa. So if you can go to the next slide, please. According to the African Bank Development Study done in 2019, so we have 55% of African countries with less than 50% of electrification. If we take the total installed capacity, so we are at 245 gigawatts. From this total capacity, we have 16% of losses, which represent 39 gigawatts. So the 16% is 7 points more than the average worldwide. This loss show us that there is a need of efficiency for the African network, and we have to work in order to fix it. The same study shows also that in addition to this loss of 39 gigawatts, if we will not fix it in 2025, so we will need 85 additional gigawatts. And the solution could be the distributed electrical resources, for example. So overall in 2025, in order to answer to the need, the increasing of the need, we will have to increase the total capacity by 50%, which will bring us to 330 gigawatts. If you can go to the next slide, please. So even by increasing by 50% of the total capacity, we will continue to have 600 million people in Africa who will be without access to energy. So in a very nutshell, we have mainly two big challenges that we have to face for Africa. The first one is the access to energy in order to respect the SDG 7 and to bring affordable and clean energy to everyone. And the second one is also the efficiency. As we've seen, and as my colleagues and the panelists has shown to us, so there is a losses in the grid. This losses is occurred because of the level of the network, but it's also depending. It's also depending on the capacity to fix these losses. So in a very nutshell, in order to fix the issues of the access to energy and the efficiency, the smart grid could be the solution, as this solution could increase the efficiency of the grid and able to integrate it, the DERs. As you know, in fact, so if you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, as you know, the smart grid will be able, in fact, to integrate the decentralized resources. So in a very nutshell, what are the main drivers that will allow us to go or to adopt the smart grid? First of all is the cost of the losses. So the 16% of the loss in the African grid capacity is representing 2% of the GDP. So if we are fixing this issue, we will save 2% of the African GDP. The second one is the cost of the electricity. So in average, the cost of 1 kilowatt per hour is $0.5, which is almost twice the cost in Europe. This is also due to the fact that the electricity is based in Africa on the fuel, and it depends a lot on the scarcity of the fuel and on the international fluctuation of the oil. The second one is, as we seen previously, is the insufficient generation capacity that we have in Africa, and finally the issues that we have in the infrastructures, which is conducting a lot of shutdowns and a lot of maintenance that need to happen. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in order to answer to all these challenges, the smart grid could be the solution. As you can see in the top of the slide, the classical grid is going linear from the generation to the transmission to the distribution. We've seen that the increase of the demand will push us to have more and more decentralized resources. So in order to integrate them and in order to be able them to be efficient, in order to distribute correctly and according the need, we need a digital grid who will use, in fact, digital tools to monitor, manage, and control the transmission and the distribution. And this is what we are calling overall a smart grid. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in a very nutshell, if we are thinking economics, because as I said at the beginning, the main detractors of the digital grid, it's about the cost of the grid. And if we take the ROI, so we will see that the digital grid will reduce significantly the cost of the operation and the maintenance. It's also improving the power and the network efficiency by reducing the loss. It's a good, smart answer to the demand, as it can predict, detect, and sometimes even fix the problems in the grid. It's also reduce the unplanned outage and downtime, and even the load shedding. And finally, as we are detecting early enough the issues in the grid, we are fixing it quickly enough, so it extends the operational lifetime of the asset. In a very nutshell, the smart grid will bring up to 10% of energy saving, and it could avoid until 16% of the losses. This will also allow an improvement of the customer satisfaction. So in the areas where we have a smart grid and we did some studies, we find that there is plus 80% of customer satisfaction. And overall, it reduced significantly the shutdowns, and it's allowed to have energy every time. Next slide, please. So here what we wanted to present in a very nutshell, it's a project which is really the pride of Schneider Electric, as in fact we contribute to digitize 4 control center power in Egypt. And this project, and thanks to our solution, which names is Advanced Distributor Management System, or in a very shorter way, ADMS. It allows us to power 20 million Egyptian, and it's allowed to leapfrog the situation and to digitize the Egyptian grid. This next slide, please. This solution and the digitals allows us also to ensure our mission, which is life is on, everyone, everywhere, for everyone, at every moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those remarks and also sharing about smart grids. I think I'm a little more excited about smart grids just by the fact that, you know, they reduce operational costs and improve efficiency, which is what many businesses across the African continent are looking forward to, reducing on the load shedding as well as operation lifetime of the assets being extended. I think that's very important as well. Thank you so much, Mel Shadley, for those remarks as well on smart grids and digitalization of grids in Africa and the opportunities as well that come with it. Our next speaker is going to be talking about investing in grids to meet the needs of rapidly urbanizing countries. Many African countries have rapidly urbanized, and with it has come a great demand for electrification. Our speaker, Ignacio Perez Arriaga, is a professor at MIT, Universidad Pontificia Comillas at the Florence School of Regulation. I hope I pronounced that right. The floor is yours now. Please talk to us about you know, the investing in grids and meeting the needs of our rapidly urbanizing population.
Thank you very much, Joy. Hello, everyone, wherever you are. And congratulations to Grids4Africa for realizing the criticality of the electricity networks to achieve a sustainable energy development, as Salvatore Bernabé said in his introduction. So congratulations for the initiative to launch Grids4Africa. I think that the major bottleneck to make adequate progress in electricity access is the distribution network. And so I'm going to focus on distribution in this talk, and in particular in the urban and peri-urban areas. Whoever is handling my slides, be ready to pass many of them very quickly. Next one, please. Okay, so for a long time, I have thought, and also many other people, that the electrification separates into black and white, urban versus rural, and we are realizing that this is not the case. Next slide. So we have situations like in this one. This is the need separation of grid extension in black and the blue lines reaching the different houses, the dots. We see also the green, which are mini grids, and we see many dots that are standalone systems, and we tend to think in classification of grid extension, mini grids, standalone systems. The situation is more complex. Go ahead, next slide. So this is a view borrowed from Grids4Africa, some presentation in which you can see in Johannesburg that a road is separating the slums from the beautiful houses there, and the grid is present, is there, but people don't have electricity. Next one. So this is another situation, very different configuration in Lagos. And you have also the outskirts of the city of Lagos and many houses without electricity. Next one. The outskirts of Johannesburg, you see poles and the neighborhood without access to electricity. Next one. Slums in the vicinity of Mumbai in India. And again, you see the proximity of the areas that have electricity and less than 100 meters from it, areas without electricity. Next one. So who are those people that have to be electrified still in urban and peri-urban areas? So they are those that live in electrified areas, but have decided, for whatever reason, we will see, not to connect. We have also those forcibly displaced because of violence, immigration, many reasons. And also you have the global urbanization trend that we will be talking about. That is the movement that in general is taking place from the rural areas towards the cities. Next one. So in the first case, what we have is people that are under the grid, but they are not connected. And you can see in sub-Saharan Africa, in many of the countries, what is the situation. The darker the color, the more people are connected to the grid. But you have countries with light colors in which the uptake, the connection rates are about 40 to 50% only. And this is because the connection costs are very high, because they are poor and they cannot pay for the cost of electricity, or that the grid is so unreliable that it's not worth it to connect to it. Next one. Another situation is the number of people that in the past year have been more than 80 million of people forcibly displaced because of wars, because of droughts, because of violence in different ways. And you can see in the lower part that on the right, that the situation, the number of these forcibly displaced people is increasing. These are people that move to refugee camps, but most of them move to cities. Next one. And then we will examine what happens with the global trend towards urbanization. In this the latest report by the United Nations, we can see that the reason that the urban population is growing is, well, people have more children and the population grows, but also the moving of people from rural to urban areas. And it is projected by that 2050, there will be 2.5 billion more people that will be in urban areas, and 90% of those will be in Asia and Africa. For instance, in a country like Nigeria, it is expected that 190 million people will move from rural to urban by 2050. Next one. So the proportion of people in urban areas in 1950 was 30%, now has surpassed 55%, and it is expected to be by 2050, 68%. So there is a clear trend towards urbanization. Africa is delayed in that process, so that means that they will have to catch up, and the progression towards urbanization will be faster, because currently the proportion of urban population is 43%. Next one. So you can see very clearly the trend in brown urban, in green rural. Next one. More facts. 1 out of 8 urban dwellers live in one of these mega cities, so cities with more than 10 million people. And in most cases, people living in urban areas that have been displaced, they have moved to them, live in slums. So the number of people living in slums will move from the current 1.6 billion to almost 3 billion by 2050. In some countries, there are more children living in slums than living in the rest of the country. Next one. And you will see in a progression of 4 slides how this has been evolving. You can see the color brown, dark brown means a lot of urbanization, light brown less, and the other colors lower levels of urbanization. And the red dots that in 1970, in this case, is only New York, Shanghai, and Tokyo, will grow and grow. So next one, let's move now to 1990. In 1990, you see more brown dark colors and you see more red dots. And the other dots mean cities that are also large but don't reach 10 million inhabitants. More, the next one. So this is currently, and you see that there are about 33 mega cities with more than 10 million people, and the color brown is dominating. Next one. This is for what is estimated for 2030, and you see that the dark brown is dominating, and you have lots of mega cities. Next one, please. So the strategy is not to fight urbanization. Urbanization is good. People move to cities because of a good reason. The target, the objective is to share the benefits of urbanization with everybody, to ensure to infrastructure and social services for everybody living in urban and peri-urban areas. Next one. So what are the challenges and what are the approaches that have been successful? The problem, the initial problem, is that the incumbent distribution companies in charge of providing electricity services in these conditions are in dire financial situation. Next one. Probably everybody has seen this next slide that shows that in sub-Saharan Africa, the tariffs, the circles for each one of the countries are not able to pay the operating cost, orange, or the capital costs in green. And only a couple of countries have distribution companies that are able to cover their costs with the regulated tariffs. Next one. And also, the situation is that the level of investment in distribution is not fixing the problem because it is very inadequate. Next one. So in this document, which is the latest one that explains what is the landscape of financing for access, next one, we will see a very complex chart, which is this one that I would spend all my time describing it. So the only thing that I want to tell you is that that explains how the flows of funding go to the 20 countries with the highest problem of access in the world. And it shows whether the source of the funding comes from different types of institutions, whether it is domestic or international, whether and what is the type of funding, what is debt, equity, concessional, commercial, etc., where that is domestic or international, private or public, and then to which segment of the electricity supply it goes, generation, transmission, distribution, and then the end consumers. I'm going to focus on the end consumption for residential uses, and you have the residential uses divided into tiers. Next one. In the next one, we will see which is the origin of these flows. And we see that most of the money that this classified as funding for access goes to all that is renewables, generation, all that is fossil, generation, and these tiny parts here are transmission and distribution and off-grid solutions. Next one. And the origin of the money coming to the transmission, distribution, and off-grid is mostly public and a little bit private partnerships. So we have, as has been indicated by other people before, we have a serious problem of funding in the distribution area. Next one. And this slide, that again, I will not go into the details, is showing that most of the funding is not going to the countries in most need. So on top of what we have seen before, what we see is that investors, not all of them, but many of them, go to, it's obvious, where they could get a larger profit for their investment. And they don't go to the difficult areas, which are distribution in developing countries with a lot of problems of access. Next one. So how to address the problem? Next one. We have been working in my group at MIT and Comillas University in something that we call the integrated distribution framework, applying some basic principles that are universal access, not leaving anybody behind, the mix of on and off grid solutions. In these peri-urban and urban areas, most of the solution, of course, will have to be grid extension, but in some cases where the distribution company is paralyzed and cannot do some investment, the ideas of deploying, it was said in the previous talk, standalone system solar kits and mini grids under the grid could be a good solution. The solutions have to be financially viable. The tariffs have to be cost reflective, or the remuneration has to be cost reflective, including the tariffs that could be subsidized plus a subsidy. And the purpose of all that is development, human and economic development. Next one. And this is the focus of the solution in these cases. So, for instance, in these two documents, and there are many similar, they describe what are successful practices in addressing these informal settlements with electricity provision. Next one. So the difficulties that are encountered are that the legal status of the informal settlements, because people don't own the land or they don't own where they are living, the high level of theft of electricity, the lack of capacity of the distribution company to control these illegal connections, safety problems in the wiring, appropriate metering, and the need to subsidize the supply because of the low income level of the population in general. Next one. So the best practices focus on a social compact between the government, the utility, and the local population that must work together to find a common solution. And that means that the connection cost has to be subsidized or eliminated, social tariffs are needed, unsafe wiring and informal land tenure have to be addressed. The technology has to be adapted to the capability of the people and the situation, and a good payment has to be encouraged. How to achieve all that? Next one. Well, there are vicious and virtuous circles. If you start with poor service, then the solution is impossible because the customer will be an adversary. So the first step is to provide sound service so that people are willing to pay and willing to use the electricity. I will not go into the details. These explanations can be found in the documents that I showed before. Next one. In the next one, these documents show how to approach electrification of the slums with a number of steps that have to be followed in order to succeed. And I will talk about it, just a case example to finish. Next one. So this is the case that was also mentioned by Antonio Camisegra before in India. This is a different one. This is the city of Delhi. This is the time, the moment when it was signed, the concession agreement, not privatization, a concession agreement with the Tata Power Delhi. Next. People didn't take very gladly in the next one. This is what happened in the first meeting of the board of the Tata Power Delhi. The population didn't think that this concession to a private institution would be successful, but it was. Next one. And now the people of Delhi have good power, and they are happily paying their cost-reflective tariffs. And the solution followed these steps, improving the reliability, using information and communication technologies to enhance the service to the customers and to make sure that everybody was paying, understanding the problems of the customers, doing a good job in managing the commercial activities of the company, focusing on performance measures of people connected, reliability, and establish a good brand image and raising the self-esteem of the employees. Next one. And this is the last one. So maybe my takeaway is that the technical difficulties in the electrification of these urban and peri-urban areas is probably the least of the challenges. Most of the challenges are of different nature: social, political, cultural, land use, safety, etc., that have to be addressed during the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for those detailed remarks as well, and giving us some insights into, urbanization of countries on the African continent, using examples of some of the countries outside of Africa, like India and what's happening there. In fact, I think India is the best case example to use for how exactly to urbanize electrification, because much of what India has experienced, a lot of African countries as well have and are still going through the same. So thank you so much for that. Investing in grids to meet the needs of our rapidly urbanizing countries, large-scale regularization, and also having a sound service so people are able and willing to pay for the service. Our next speaker is going to talk about electricity regulatory frameworks for African grids. And this is a much, much needed conversation that we need to have. So Daniel Schrott, he's going to talk about that for us. He is the advisor to the Vice President and Acting Director of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency at the African Development Bank. The floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank Grids4Africa to associate the African Development Bank to this important meeting. Transmission grids, power grids are a key priority for the African continent. Accordingly, they're also a key priority for the African Development Bank, and I believe that this initiative will further reinforce the focus on strengthening transmission and distribution grids, particularly from a perspective of accelerating Africa's energy transition. If we can move to the next slide. I've been asked to briefly talk about the aspect of regulation. And obviously, as I think all of you are aware, that grids, transmission in particular, are generally considered natural monopolies, at least within geographic areas. And from perspectives of economies of scale and also other factors such as access to land, it is simply not economically feasible to build competing critical facilities to evacuate power from specific generation plants or supply the same specific customers. So as a minimum, it is therefore necessary to regulate, one, which entities can own and operate grid infrastructure. Secondly, how the costs of investing in grid infrastructure are recovered. Third, how entities that neither own nor operate grids are granted access to those networks. And fourth, also the important aspect of how to assure quality of supply and also how to meet flexibility requirements, which is particularly important in the context of increasing the share of variable renewable energy in African grids. Now, obviously, the establishment of independent regulatory agencies is generally considered to be the best approach to perform industry regulatory functions within the country, as enabled obviously by the relevant policies, planning, legislative frameworks. And I think if we talk about independent regulatory agencies, we talk both about independence from the regulated industry, as well as independence from the political decision makers, and therefore, for example, reporting rather to the parliament than to, let's say, a line ministry which is in charge of the energy sector. So the scale of grid investments that are required to integrate variable renewable generation creates a requirement also to look into the involvement of the private sector. And I think this is an emerging area that is still very nascent, particularly in the African context. Next slide. Just to highlight that on the African Development Bank side, we have developed what we call the Electricity Regulatory Index, ERI, which is intended to empirically assess the performance of African regulators and regulatory frameworks across the electricity value chain and articulate tailored solutions of how the assessment or some of the weaknesses that have been identified can be improved. So it really has four key purposes. One is obviously a diagnosis to identify what are the gaps in electricity regulatory frameworks. The second aspect is an aspect of benchmarking, to benchmark the regulatory environment and performance of countries against their peers, and thereby also create an element of peer pressure. The third element is not just stopping at the diagnosis and the benchmarking, but really looking at solutions. What solutions can be recommended to address specific deficits or gaps in the electricity regulatory frameworks. And that links then also directly around the investments in technical assistance and also actual hard investments that are required in many instances to address some of those weaknesses. Just to highlight that we have now done the ERI for 3 years in a row. We're currently working on the 2021 edition. And as you see from that slide, the participation of countries has increased from 15 countries in 2018 to 34 countries in 2019, 36 countries in 2020, and we're targeting 42 countries in 2021. Here obviously also needs to be noted that not all African countries at this point in time do have an electricity regulatory agency. Next slide. And just to quickly highlight regarding aspects in the Electricity Regulatory Index related to the grid. So key focus is being placed on national grid codes. There's also a key aspect around electricity trade and access to grids. And of course, there's also an aspect around the regional harmonization of regulatory frameworks, particularly cross-border electricity trade, which requires robust national regulatory instruments and frameworks, but also a level of regional harmonization. And as you know, also in the African context, there are several regional regulatory associations, whether ERERA in West Africa or ERERA in Southern Africa. So three instruments frameworks considered are national transmission grid codes, the network connection policies, and regulatory mechanisms for pricing ancillary services. So in the majority of the 36 countries surveyed in the 2020 Electricity Regulatory Index, those national grid codes are not yet in place, and there's no validated network connection policy. So there's still a lot of work that requires to be done. If you can move to the next slide, please. Just to very quickly highlight in terms of the quantitative dimensions of the Electricity Regulatory Index, it basically looks as composed of three distinct and interconnected segments. So the first is what we coin the Regulatory Governance Index, which assesses the institutional and legal design of the regulatory systems and the framework within which decisions are made. That's basically looking at the how of regulation. Then we have the Regulatory Substance Index, which actually assesses the decisions that have been taken, explicit or implicit, within the regulatory agency, entity, or the government, along with the rationale for those decisions. That's really looking at the what of regulations. And then obviously the question is, what is the result of the governance framework and those decisions? And that is what the third one, the Regulatory Outcomes Index, is looking at, which is assessing the impact of the actions of the regulator and the decisions on the performance of the power utility and on consumers. All these indexes combined are then form the Electricity Regulatory Index based on those key priorities, a set of indicators and sub-indicators that are aggregated to form a composite score for each dimension and then form the overall Electricity Regulatory Index score. You move to the next slide, please. Just to highlight that looking at those three categories, governance, substance, and outcomes, one notices that there's a decreasing performance. So the governance systems frameworks generally look better than sort of the substance of the decisions, and then obviously the expected sort of the outcome from those decisions. So there's a decreasing performance related to those three dimensions. So specifically on transmission-related findings, and I've alluded to some of them earlier, I'd just like to highlight a few of them. Out of the 36 countries surveyed in 2020, only 15 or 42% have developed national transmission grid codes. Only 13 have developed electricity distribution codes. 21 of those surveyed countries have mechanisms in place to compensate for the provision of ancillary services, and the same percentage have regulatory mechanisms in place to compensate for stranded assets. Only very few have developed and validated network connection policies. So that clearly indicates that there is still a considerable amount of work to be done in relation to the regulation of transmission-related aspects. If we can move to the next slide, please. Just very quickly to show the overall result of the 2020 report with the countries that were covered. It indicates that there are very few countries at this point in time in the African context, and as you see, that mostly covers at the moment sub-Saharan Africa, that have a strong electricity regulatory framework in place. So you have several countries such as Uganda and Namibia that score relatively high, but you have 14% or 17 countries that are in the red zones with a very low electricity regulatory index in 2020. We have seen, so over the 3 years that we have been doing the ERI, slight improvements in the one or other country. But clearly this will require further concerted efforts from the countries, but also concerted support from the various partners. If you can move to the next slide, please. Just very quickly to also indicate that this is a bit broader beyond now the regulation aspect, just to highlight that the African Development Bank has considerable experience in the financing in supporting transmission and distribution projects across the continent. I would say that this is a bit our bread and butter in terms of the investments that the bank is doing. So just to give some figures, we have invested well above $3 billion in the last 20 years for some 34,000 kilometers of transmission and distribution lines. We've also supported a lot of the feasibility work that is so critical and obviously needs to be in place to allow for investments, including the NEPAD infrastructure project preparation facility that the African Development Bank is hosting. And also a particular aspect and focus of our work has been on critical interconnection links between countries, critical to forming the regional markets, and also leading to now the African single electricity market, or a key condition for the African single electricity market. Examples are the Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, CLSG interconnection. We've been involved in the Ethiopia-Djibouti interconnection, which just financed the second phase, approved just a week ago. Kenya, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Chad, Cameroon, the North Core connecting Burkina, Benin, Niger, Nigeria. So involved in many of these projects, and similarly, as you see, we've been one of the key proponents alongside the African Union Commission and NEPAD of the PIDA program. So it's the PIDA hub, the first priority action plan, where we've been involved in 10 of the 15 priority programs or corridors, and also now actively looking at the second generation PIDA hub 2. We're supporting the regional economic communities in terms of accelerating project implementation. And we're also leading the resource mobilization dimension of the Continental Transmission Master Plan, which is obviously a key tool linked to the African single electricity markets. Also, just like one sentence to highlight that through our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, and particularly its Green Baseload program, we are in a position to provide technical assistance, project preparation grants, but also critical concessional finance towards investments in grid connection infrastructure, as well as utility-scale battery storage systems that enable or contribute to enabling the large-scale integration of variable renewable energy generation. And just move to the next slide very quickly to just highlight that transmission, the grids are key focus this year, even more so than previous years, also in the context of COP26, with the Energy Transition Council that was created at the end of last year, led by the climate envoy of the United Kingdom, Alok Sharma, and the CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, Damilola, but involving several key stakeholders. And one key initiative that is being pushed in this context is the Green Grids initiative, that is looking at these different dimensions around resilient grids, how renewable energy resources can be harnessed in a more efficient way through integration, and also focusing on the aspects of technical cooperation and finance. So that is a global initiative, a global mechanism we have from our side in collaboration with partners, highlighted the importance of making sure that this global initiative helps to accelerate the various ongoing continental programs focused on strengthening Africa's grids, such as the Continental Transmission Master Plan, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA Hub 2, just to mention two most prominent examples. So we have gotten the endorsement for the creation of an Africa-focused Green Grids Initiative Working Group, which was also recently endorsed by the Specialized Technical Committee in charge of energy of the African Union Commission. So I think there are many conditions in place in that global context, also with the perspective of COP26 and beyond, to increase the focus on this key dimension. We can move to the last slide, please. Just to very quickly conclude, to highlight that obviously grids, has been highlighted, are in most cases natural monopolies, regulatory intensive segments of the electricity supply chain, which is still dominated by state-owned entities. We did a survey in 2019 observing 42 countries, and only 2 actually had any private sector involvement in transmission and 5 in distribution. There's obviously still reluctance on many government sides to relinquish sort of their hold or ownership operations of networks. But there are innovative ways of looking at involvement of private sector in transmission distribution infrastructure around PPP frameworks. And regulatory frameworks are critical in terms of making these PPP arrangements work. So that's clearly an area that will require further attention, particularly in a context where, as a result, also exacerbated by COVID-19, the public budgets of many countries are under considerable strain. And as I said, and that's my last sentence, there needs to be increased support for transmission investments, particularly also the critical interconnections, which is a key prerequisite for an accelerated energy transition in the African continent. I leave it at that, and thank you very much for the kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Schott, for those remarks. Dr. Daniel is the advisor to the Vice President and Acting Director of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency at the African Development Bank. Our next speaker is going to talk about financing for grid infrastructure in Africa. And in this case, we're talking about financing across the African continent. So Laure Blanchard-Bruneck, who is the Director of Policy and Partnerships at EDFI, is going to focus mainly on that, investing to make a difference on the African continent. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you very much to Grids4Africa and to Roberto Vigotti for arranging this opportunity for us to speak at this very important event. It's, as you will see, from the perspective of development finance institution, it's a very timely event to raise awareness on the urgency of investments in grids. Maybe the next slide, please. I will quickly first present who we are. EDFI is the Association of European DFIs, and which are all European state-owned development finance institutions. Their specialty is to work with the private sector in developing countries only. So here is the list and the map of our members in Europe. And basically, they are all working with private sector with a shared mandate of achieving the UN SDGs. And SDG 7, as discussed today, is one of the key deliverables for DFI financing. And also aligning with Paris Agreement, which is something that our members committed to last year. And they committed especially to align all their investments by 2022 with Paris Agreement and to become carbon neutral by 2050. They also will exclude fossil fuel investments by 2030 at the latest. So this is to show that obviously the sustainable energy agenda that we are discussing today is the top of the agenda for our members. And as you've noticed, we are European, and so therefore the EU Green Deal and the Global Europe financial instrument that the EU is now putting at the disposal of the private sector will be also critical partnerships for the DFIs to do more in that area. Beyond the EU, we also have some members who are extremely active in the climate space, like the UK CDC, who's a founding member of EDFI, and last but not least, Switzerland CFEM and Norway with Norfund. And you might have noticed last week the launch of the Climate Investment Fund by Norway of roughly €1 billion for developing countries. And that will be a fund managed by our member Norfund. So slide 2, please. Thank you. So when it comes to the relevance of climate finance, the DFIs are institutions that work primarily in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. 1/3 of the portfolio of the DFIs is in sub-Saharan Africa. And within this portfolio, the global portfolio of the DFIs for 2020 roughly stands at €44 billion. And out of this €44 billion, more than 10 billion is dedicated to climate finance. Only in 2020, the DFIs have invested more than €1.3 billion of climate finance. And these are mostly climate mitigation projects, power generation, but also projects to allow energy access. And you can see here a few numbers on what we achieved so far. For example, in the last financial year, there were 100 terawatts of electricity generated by projects and companies financed by EDFIs. And in terms of emission, it was our project allowed a reduction of 3.8 million tons of CO2 emissions per year. We have a specific focus of the DFIs on allowing universal and affordable access to energy as a key SDG for our members. And this requires massive grid investments. And as it was discussed earlier today by the many participants, these investments will be required to give access to people, but also to allow a more efficient infrastructure and a more sustainable infrastructure overall on the continent. I must stress here also that there is here the data you see is a lot about power generation and climate mitigation projects, but the DFIs are planning to do much more in climate adaptation, and like it was presented in the previous presentation, especially the one of Ceci, that the grid investments will also be about adapting to the climate situation. Next slide, please. So in terms of what the DFIs are planning to do in grid infrastructure, as I said, DFIs will be focusing primarily on private sector investments. We heard a lot of things are happening on the side of the public sector investments, like our colleague from AFDB has mentioned just earlier in the previous presentation, but still private sector investments in grid is clearly on the low end. We see, however, a need to invest in grid enhancement, grid expansion, modernization and digitalization. And these are all from a banker perspective, from a DFI perspective, and from private investors perspective, these are extremely challenging subsectors. And there needs to be a transformation of these sectors, which are mostly controlled by the public entities. And these are clearly for us market failures where we need to partner with donors. So why these are market failures for DFI investment, but more generally for private sector investment? Well, the grid, as we heard many times earlier, that it has a rather small footprint compared to what is actually needed for access to all in Africa. And when it has a footprint, the state of the grid is rather poor. So obviously that creates a lot of issues like described before with the stability of the grid. And there are, on top of that, from a private investor perspective and a DFI perspective, quite a lot of issues of governance with potential political interference in the projects. And when we invest, try to invest where our assets have rather autonomy. The management of these assets has autonomy to deliver on with efficiency and you know, accountability toward their clients. And also, most importantly, like it was flagged in the MIT presentation, especially, there's a massive issue of affordability for the end consumers. That all this makes it extremely challenging to have a convincing business case for what are the sectors of distribution, transmission networks, and also storage solutions, which, however, are direly needed and will be even more needed over time. So I will conclude by saying that you know, 75% of the global population without access to energy live in sub-Saharan Africa, and investing in grid infrastructure will be crucial for energy access for all and for the development of sustainable energy ecosystem. So our DFIs, the European DFIs, will invest, and they will request the support of donors to mobilize private investors in this very important sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laure Blanchard-Bruneck, who is the Director of Policy and Partnerships at EDFI, and for highlighting as well, you know, how to go about financing and how much more investment has been put into climate change as well, climate change related programs. And that's what we have basically been here for. To find out what are the electricity frameworks for grids, and also to answer the question of how do we go about financing of the grid infrastructure, in addition to having the Grids4Africa program that Res4Africa would like to take on to create awareness about grid infrastructure and also the opportunities and challenges that we are presented with. And now it's time for us to have a real quick roundtable. So I'm going to ask that we activate our video. If you are on the Grids4Africa roundtable, we're each going to have about 1 minute and 30 seconds to share our thoughts on how best we think we should go about the Grids4Africa on the continent. So Jean-Pierre Sanchez from Siemens Gamesa and Neil van der Meeuwen, I hope I pronounced that right, didn't butcher your name, from RENA Southern Africa, and Cecile Leemans from the European Commission, as well as Vivek Mittal from AFIDA Africa. And we also have Antonio Nodari, who is the AFRY Management Consulting from the AFRY Management Consulting. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Antonio Nodari, and quickly, if you could tell us what you think your thoughts are on Grids4Africa and how best you think it can be implemented.
First, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Joy. First of all, thank you to allow me to say something. Yes, I think that the grid, as the different speakers have said, are the backbone of any energy system. And without an efficient and capillary grids, the benefit of renewables deeper penetration cannot really be grasped. And this is particularly true for Africa, where the access to energy is one of the major uses, as we have seen. So this is the reason why I think we as AFRY welcome very well Grids4Africa. We have been glad to have participated in the inception consultation, and obviously it will be also our interest to work together with the other members on the development of these activities. And we are convinced of two things. First of all, that the foundation is very well positioned to support this activity, thanks to the deep understanding of the risking needs for large infrastructure investment, like we have also seen as a key point, and the capacity to represent the focal point of an extensive expertise field that is represented by the member. And AFRY, for example, has contributed to the Missing Link project, where the regulatory aspect for the network has been also touched. As AFRY, finally, I think we can contribute with our broad set of competences and skills that covering markets, regulation, technology, engineering, and innovation. And we believe that particularly the role of innovation and digitalization is key to ensure a sustainable development of the African energy industries. And this is where we want to bring also our contribution. So thanks again, and let's start together this new exciting journey.
Voice.
We cannot hear you, Joy.
We cannot hear you, Joyce.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Antonio Nodari, for those remarks. He's the head of Central and South Europe, AFRY Management Consulting, and Managing Director in Italy. We'd now like to hear from Cecile Leemans, who is the International Relations Officer, Directorate of General Energy, European Commission. What are your thoughts? Because Nodari has talked about the missing link, but would like to hear from you. How best do you think this can be implemented?
Well, thank you everyone also for the very interesting presentation we have had so far. I think there's a clear need for infrastructure in Africa and in electricity in particular if we want to power the development that the continent needs. I mean, obviously, we as the European Union and together with the member states are strong supporter to renewable energy development in Africa. We have also been doing quite a lot when it comes to working with the African Union in their development of the Africa Single Energy Market with a Continental Master Plan. We finance a number of grid developments, and obviously it's very interesting to see that now there is also this initiative coming up and this interest by the private sector to find ways to accelerate the momentum. I think we have seen more and more private sector participation in the generation part, and I think it's interesting to see the same kind of engagement on the grid. I always believe that when the private sector takes interest, it helps to make things move. And obviously aid won't be enough to get the investment we are looking for. And if we can then pool and leverage what we have with the private sector capacity, it will bring us further, I think, when it comes to develop the grids we are looking for. And I very shortly would just highlight the fact that at the Commission, we are in the process of rethinking our partnership with Africa on energy. We want to have a more holistic approach, and we are developing the Green Energy Initiative, which in particular pays a lot of attention on all the efforts that have to be done into the sector reforms so that it adjusts to the new design of the energy system, and in particular using our aid to increase the capacity of regulators, of utilities, to manage a different grid, a new grids, and this will be complementing all the work and all the support we provide to investments. And I really believe that by working together, private sector, academia, donors, we heard of the EDFI, while each of us does what they do best, we can go further than if we all work in our point. So there will be some announcement coming at the EU-AU summit at early 2022, where we will be disclosing a little more. But certainly the importance of grids, being it also mini grids, to achieve the SDG 7 is really very close to our heart and will be our focus in the future. Thank you. Can't hear you.
You're muted.
This is serious. I'm actually the one eating up the time. Thank you so much, Cecil Lumens. I do appreciate those remarks, and we look forward to hearing more about the green energy commitment at the AU Summit in January or February, around early 2022 as well. I'd now like to come to Pierre Sanchez, who is the Africa Business Development Manager at Siemens Gamesa. And I know that you have quite a big portfolio in Northern Africa, as well as Southern Africa and Central Africa. But I want to hear from you because Professor did mention the challenge being more on the social and cultural side when it comes to investment in Africa's electricity sector. So I want to hear from you, what are your thoughts on implementing the Grids4Africa program?
Thank you, Joy. So, well, very interesting event, and I think many points have been touched related to the grid. Well, I would like to congratulate Grids4Africa also for addressing this topic, because when we refer to the to the energy, is probably not the sexiest one, but I think it's as important as the generation. As the generation is. Okay. What I want is to share a little bit of experience as a wind turbine manufacturer in Africa. Okay, related to the grid. So, well, first of all, that's clear that is one of the main bottlenecks when we want to exploit the huge resources on wind that Africa has. I mean, it has been also reported lately all the huge potential, and one of the main reasons is not having access to the good sites. I mean, it's not a surprise that the three biggest markets in terms of wind in the continent are the ones that have a stronger grid, but not necessarily the ones that have the best wind resources. And one of the reasons is, is this. So basically, as I said, we need to connect the good sites to the consumption areas, but also what we need to do is to interconnect the different countries and to support the interconnections in order to be able to cope with the variability of the renewable energy, in order to export the potential surplus that we can be having, and import when the production is not enough. So as it has been said during the session, a lot of effort and a lot of interest have been paid to the generation. And I think it's the moment now to change the approach, and we need to dedicate more support, more interest, and more finance to the grid, to the infrastructure of the grid, because really, if we want to boost the energy, the renewable energy in the continent, this is really a step that we need to take. So, well, I mean, congratulations for the initiative, and we will be supporting all the different steps, because really this is going into the good direction.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Jean-Pierre Sanchez. Much appreciated. Now, I'd finally like to hear from Vivek Mittal, who is the Chief Executive Officer at AFIDA Africa. You know, one of our previous speakers did mention the fact that in order for us to fix this, to fix the access gap in Africa, we need to invest. We can all agree that we need to invest in grid infrastructure, modern infrastructure, smart grids, you know, and so much more. But then there's the issue of governments and all the challenges that come with it, our frameworks. But we are presented with an opportunity of the Internet of Things and, you know, the energy efficiency that can be, the potential that Jean-Pierre talked about. Tell us what your thoughts are on all of this and going forward, what we need to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joy. Thank you to Grids4Africa for having me. I will start with what intervention, and then I'll explain why. The two things, so very excellent presentations, excellent points. The two things I would emphasize and perhaps suggest we do differently in this initiative of grids is, one is we should tie in grid development, energy sector development, country by country or possibly regionally, to a master plan, economic master plan. And I think Mrs. Cecile referred to that in her, hopefully, you know, we look forward to hearing what the EU-AU conference has to say. The second is in the narrative of grid investment, I would suggest that grid expansion does not necessarily equate to energy access, solving energy access. So let me explain these two. AFIDA is a non-profit association of private sector investors in infrastructure in Africa. We have 35 members that include Grids4Africa as member, NL, along with AIM, which African Infrastructure Investment Managers, Actis, CDC, FMO, DEG, Africa 50, and Africa Finance Corporation, for example. There are others. We have others. Between them, they have about $40 billion of investment capital for infrastructure in Africa, dominated by the energy sector. Now, we hold, and part of our advocacy work, we hold public-private partnership discussions regionally and sectorally. And there's a great demand for PPP and grid from our members. That is essentially to enhance, to get access to well-paying customers and get away from financially stretched utilities. And it's also to address grid losses. That's where the private sector can have a big impact. However, there's a lot of headwinds towards this. There is a perception in government that we pick up all the time, that the risk-reward balance between private and public is not right. The public sector takes on a lot more risk and has to pay high tariffs. And I'll give you a specific example. I mean, the Kenyan energy sector is at a standstill now. They've drawn about $2 billion of investment over the last 10 years in generation. That's at a standstill because the government is very stressed. KPLC, the grid company, is very stressed. Over the last 6 years, KPLC has taken on nearly $700 million of new debt to create 4 million more connections. So they've doubled their debt. They've doubled the connections in Kenya. However, out of the nearly 8 million connections they have, only 700 connections account for 50% of their offtake. So the average of the new connections, which have costed $700 million, is 600 kilowatt hours a year, which can never pay that investment back. Yeah. So that is a very important aspect to look forward to. In terms of the first point I made, so that's why grid expansion doesn't equal to energy access. master plan, if you look at why an economic master plan is important, take the same example of Kenya, we have, and I'm finished over here, Kenya currently serves 9.2 terawatt hours. For an economy of 50 million people with $100 billion, if you look at comparative countries with same sort of population, same sort of GDP, Morocco, Ukraine, and such like, Algeria, they use about 3 times that energy. Now, the economic planning that happens in Kenya, they're looking to get to 3 times of energy supply in 20 years, which is the wrong way to do it. I mean, they're essentially looking to lock in the unserved. Right. So that's my intervention, which I should stop with. But all of you are welcome to our discussions as we move forward. Thank you.
All right. So grid expansion doesn't necessarily equate to access in this case. Appreciate that. And thank you all so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your contribution as well to this conversation. I'd now like to invite Mr. Roberto Vigorti, who is the Secretary General for the Renewable Energy Solutions for Africa Foundation, to give us our closing remarks, because we've come close to the end. If not, we are at the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mama Joy, for this impeccable and charming way of helping us in developing this topic. I will be very short because the time helps me to be short. Now is the time of spaghetti in the fort in Italy, so we have to cut it. Now, thank you the participant, thank you the speaker, thank you the presentation. They will be available, all of them, on the website next week, and also we have recorded the events, so in case somebody doesn't take a sleep at night, you can go back and see another 2.5 hours of presentation. I think we received a complimentary views, and was not done on purpose. Everybody added some little stone in this mosaic. I think we have now a clear idea of the way to go and how urgent and how important this topic is. We have been working already on our new deliverables, which will be available. One is a very short position paper that you will receive soon after this meeting. All of you, is about 7 pages. It is just a short summary to bring the context of why we're working on Grids4Africa. But the second one will be, we are doing a survey on the involvement of the private sector in grids, and we will launch this in a second event in maybe end of September, October, to launch the program. Now, we will go in details on those topics because the role of private sector in supporting the deployment. We will tackle also additional issue, financing, urban, peri-urban access, digital solution, etc., etc. And I can confirm that after the summer, I will convene a dedicated meeting among all the presenters and also the roundtable people to elaborate a couple of year program for Grids4Africa to go ahead. So let me just conclude that I'm very proud that today up to 300 people were present at the meeting, which is not usual, particularly because we are flooded with the webinar. Every day there are 2-3 webinars, and another webinar in the afternoon with the Commission. So, but thank you for your interest. Be sure that we will keep you updated. And of course, this is another additional stone to Joy, who will be soon be qualified for the energy experts, just attending our meetings, and hopefully the target is there, Joy. Thank you so much for all of you, and thanks for your attention, and be back to you after summer. And now we do spaghetti and meat now. Joy, you can close if you want.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roberto Vigorti, for those remarks. And of course, about the Grids4Africa program, just like Mr. Vigorti mentioned, you can find all the information also on the website. That is res4africa.org or .org. And in case you need further information as well, you can go to the contact section on the website and ask whatever questions, and they will be responded to. All of the presentations as well are going to be loaded on the site, so you're going to be able to access them as of next week. For now, thank you all so much for taking part, and I know that it's lunchtime pretty much everywhere around the world. So thank you all so much for attending the launch of Grids4Africa. Best of luck to all of you, and we're looking forward to investment on the African continent. Bye-bye for now.
Come si fa a chiudere qui adesso? Boh. Chiudi un po', perché così. Perfetto.
Thank you.